We're going to start. Happy Friday. So this week we have a little bit different, still in the engineering realm, but from a biotechnology perspective. We have Dr. Kaelyn Gamel from Naval Undersea Worker Center. Or Newport, sorry. That's okay, sorry. She did her undergraduate and master's degree in biology at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And then she went to the University of Akron for a Ph.D. in integrated bioscience. Currently, she's a research scientist at Naval Undersea Worker Center Division Newport within the U.S. Navy, continuing her Ph.D. work in underwater walking and using the force plate as a hydrodynamic sensor. So please give a warm welcome to Dr.
How's everybody's Friday going? Good? Like Hannah said, I'm Dr. Kaelyn Gamel, and today I'm going to talk about insight from evolution and the Remora Adhesion and the water to land transition. So I won't go over too much of this because she kind of said I started as growing up in life as an athlete, and so a lot of my brain has been about functional morphology and biomechanics. If I move this way, how is my body reacting, and like what ways can I become more efficient to move? So I did Division I soccer and fencing, and then a little bit of track and field. Wasn't great at it though. And this is where I did a lot of my Remora work, which is pictured below. Sorry, covering some of the screen. And then I went to the University of Akron for my PhD in integrated bioscience. This is where I picked up a lot of my engineering skills that you'll see throughout my presentation. And I studied on biomechanics of underwater walking. So if some of you guys are familiar with Stephen Vogel, he's a comparative biomechanist, and he wrote a textbook, was about 1,200 pages, and I was reading through this textbook and I kept looking for underwater walking, like went to the index, I was like, okay, underwater walking is on this page, and I opened it and it had one paragraph about it, and I was like, this is our god of comparative biomechanics. Why has no one studied underwater walking? Well, it's really complicated, right? So we have a lot of things involved in underwater walking. But first, we're going to start with Remora adhesion. So remoras, they will attach themselves to sharks, whales, turtles, anything larger than themselves, even humans. When people are scuba diving, you'll see remoras attached to them. And what's really unique about this system is that they have a modified dorsal fin. So if you're familiar with fish, they have the dorsal fin on the back, and they will have a suction cup with lamellae that sit inside the suction cup. And so the suction cup is right here, and then the lamellae will sit parallel with the direction of flow. So through evolution, we have epistomyzin right here, and this was an extant fossil record that we had found, and it had lamellae, and they had 4 lamellae within their suction cup. They didn't have a complete form of suction cup, so through evolution, the dorsal fin essentially shrunk down, and so as they continued to swim closer to sharks, whales, they would not mentally know this, but they would notice the shark is moving away. It's too sharp, dorsal fin. So eventually it shrunk down to have those lamellae sitting in top. And this is what the lamellae look like. And then over time, we ended up getting spinnules. So these are the little shark teeth that are kind of on those lamellae. And this is actually a big advocacy for generating friction. So when you have the suction cup and then you have the lamellae sitting inside the suction cup, as the flow is coming across, that friction is being generated by the lamellae, so it's not allowing it to slip off. Suction cups don't have friction, they're just relying on the suction, right? So when you add lamellae, you are able to stay on your system and generate friction to counteract that shear force of the fluid. Here's a bit more, these are CT scans of the evolution of the lamellae system inside of the remora. And over time, we just see that there's a greater generation of number of lamellae. So me and my master's advisor were like, okay, this is interesting, but why? Like, does it matter how many you have? Is there a certain point where friction, you no longer need to generate more friction? So we really looked into how useful it was to have lamellae. So what we did for our study, we looked at changing how many lamellae sit inside the suction cup. We started with just pure suction and generating friction. And we tested on a few different types of surfaces, and this is the biomimetic model. So this biomimetic model, it is 3D printed with the Formlab, and there's two different materials in it. So this is like a hard material, and then the soft material around. Formlabs offers a lot of different resin types that allow you to have different material structures. So there's some that are, I think one's called Rigid 4000, and it's really tough, and so it won't like bend or anything. This was just the generic resin-based system. And what we found in our research was that as you add lamellae in time, that essentially suction isn't as big of a factor. Friction is actually more important in this system. And so we tested on a few different surfaces, smooth, 350, 180, and 100 grit. So we just took sandpaper. We put mold, a soft, I can't remember the word right now, but it's fine. We essentially made a mold that emulates different surface roughnesses. So we could compare how the lamellae and the spinnules are interacting with different surfaces, the surface roughnesses. And what we really found was really interesting that right about here is that the system is transitioning from relying on suction to relying on friction. So when you're adding the lamellae into our suction cup, you're taking away some of the cavity space, right? So you're no longer having as much pressure underneath. So we're essentially removing some of the suction, but now we're adding more friction. And so we just pulled it back by a force transducer and quantified how much force these could withstand and for how long. And that's kind of our results here. So super interesting. I'm excited to see where some of the group here is going to continue some of this research on. And this is a big inspiration for whale tags or turtle tags, you name it, something that can stay on the system longer than just regular suction cups. This inspiration is looking to create more long-term sensors. So these suction cups usually last for like only a day long and they'll fall off. I've heard a few go for like a week or two, but this application, I think it will help because of that shear force. I think there's some turbulence happening on the whale that essentially like rips the suction cup off from shear forces. So I'm going to transition now into underwater walking. This is where more of my research has gone now. So biomechanics is the study of the mechanical properties of a living organism. I know you guys are a lot of engineers here, so I apologize, it's a little biology based, but I'm still looking at it with a biology lens, but also have a smaller lens of an engineering thought process. And so a lot of the biomechanics is very well defined for terrestrial locomotion. So as we're walking on land, we have the ground reaction forces. We're pushing forward, a propulsive force. We're also braking, that's the F force, and then we have side-to-side forces. So when we're stepping, if we're not really stable, we're having more of those medial lateral forces, and then obviously vertical. And this is really well explained with slip, which is a single leg inverted pendulum. So as we're walking, our energetic efficiency is going up and down for potential and kinetic energy. And this is very well defined terrestrially. We also have other systems like cockroaches that are also generating ground reaction forces. That's pretty well studied. And then fish locomotion, we have fluid, we're imparting momentum on the fluid to move forward to generate thrust. We also have buoyancy and gravity affecting us. And then flying, very well defined. And it talks about lift and drag and how those mechanics all add in together. And so these systems have been really well studied, but underwater walking, no one's really touched. So when we're thinking about it, just walking on land, we have our reaction forces, and then we have gravity acting on us, right? So whatever mass you have to work, your biomechanics have to work for your mass. So as we see animals get larger and larger, a lot of their appendages comes underneath them. So if I'm a giraffe, everything is underneath me because it's counteracting gravity. But when we get into water, we start to see that we're not having to work. Our body is supported, right? So it's a bit different of a system. And we have swimming, which we're generating a thrust force. We have buoyancy and gravity acting on us, and then we have that drag force. But when we combine the two, we have this reaction force still happening, right? So the animals are interacting with that substrate. So they're still having those reaction forces, but now they have to deal with those drag forces, the buoyancy, gravity, and then having some lift potentially. And so this is where a lot of my PhD work and current work is exploring more on the impacts of buoyancy, impacts of surface area, Reynolds numbers, scaling properties, you name it. And a lot of animals actually do this, right? So we have crabs, we have turtles, we have lobsters, we have frogfish, we have hippos, the list goes on and on, newts, skates, they have modified pelvic fins that interact with that substrate when they're swimming right above that substrate. And they'll actually punt and hit that substrate to generate that reaction force to move forward. Other salamanders, epileptic sharks. There was one more. I forget the name of this guy. Just gonna forget. And another type of, kind of like an eel type system, and they have these modified limbs. And they use those to interact with the substrate as well. Crocodiles, alligators, you name it. Cavefish, and then my study system was axolotls. So before the whole craze about Minecraft and what axolotls were, I actually got involved with them. And then like a few months later, I started seeing little plushies of axolotls at stores. And I'm like, why is my study animal here? Like no one really knows what an axolotl is. So then everyone started buying me axolotl plushies, so. So I really wanted to study how gravity affects this locomotion pattern. And one of my questions was like, why should we understand this and why is it important? And it really comes back to the biological question for me. It's, well, why did we transition from water to land? And how did evolution essentially form our body geometry from this? And this is images of Tiktaalik, who is one of the most renowned fossils that have been found this past 20 years. So we found that in the fossil record that specifically on our elbow, that there was a part where the muscle would attach to and it reoriented itself. So originally it was on the front side and then reoriented itself to here. So now we can generate this type of movement. So that reformation of where the muscle is attaching allows us this type of movement. Without him, we wouldn't be able to go like this. And this is some of the evolution, so I apologize for you guys that being engineers, but I think it's a really important understanding. So we have this like a stabilizing selection process where there's only certain parts of the body that's really changing how it's evolving over time. So we see the fish ancestors really changing morphology based off of their feeding mechanism, right? So it's changing how they're eating because there might be different types of food that's accessible depending on that niche. And then when we start seeing tetrapods come up, we have a directional selection. So that means in evolution that it is highly selective to change how you are essentially moving, right? Because it's changing how much gravity is applied to that body. So it's now going from water and land, and it's changing how its mechanics are done. So that directional selection is essentially helping that system change its biomechanics. And the rates of it is what's really, really important. So you see fast rates of change. So we see way more rates of change in the back part of our tetrapods. And so it's over time in evolution. Originally it was like fine to walk with your forearms just underwater, but once you started transitioning to that land, those back limbs became very important to generate those propulsive forces. And that's how a lot of terrestrial animals move. So if you're thinking of a dog, right, when it's going and running, it's catching itself with its front limbs, braking, generating some propulsive force, but the back limbs are mostly propulsive. There's not much braking happening. So this is a single leg inverted pendulum model. And this is like the potential and kinetic energy. And just remember when you're you have a pendulum, right? Your kinetic energy is greatest when? Middle, right? And then or potential energy is here. That's where it's greatest. And then it comes down and meets 0. And then it has greater potential energy here as it swings back. Kinetic energy is greatest, and then it swings back and forth. So the energy fluctuations change. And for me, when I'm thinking about adding this to an engineering system, what are we not efficient about? Our energy consumption, right? When we think about UUV station keeping, they are consuming a ton of energy just to stabilize. But if they can sink to the bottom and just hold on to the substrate, they might be able to exacerbate how long they are out in the environment. So some of the prior studies that have been done, a lot of kinematics, right, for underwater walking. So looking just at how the position values of each of the limbs or how the back lateral line is going. So we looked at, Miriam Ashley Ross looked at terrestrial newts and then submerged newts and looked at how their kinematics differed. And they found that there's a longer period of time where their limbs is up in water. So again, because they're not forced to counteract gravity, they can kind of float and use their buoyancy to their advantage. And terrestrially, they have to have their limbs down longer because that's how their body is being supported. But when they're in water, they're supported by water, so they don't have to be touching the substrate for longer periods of time. And they don't have to generate as much force, which is what I found. So in order to actually study the kinetics of underwater walking, I had to custom build a force plate. So a lot of sensors that you guys might know of, like food tech sensors, super expensive, and they have certain directionality. So like one food tech sensor is $1,000 and it only gets one direction. So I investigated on how to create my own load cell, and I used strain gauges, and I would attach them to this bone-like structure. So it would, as a force was applied here, the shear beam load cell would go like this, and then the strain gauge would sense that deformation. And this allowed me to get XYZ components of the force. And so I custom built this PCB and used a INA 125P amplifier and then put the strain gauges in a Wheatstone bridge configuration. So what that means is that the strain gauges are working together essentially to amplify our signal. So we have 4 strain gauges here, and then there's a shear beam load cell. So we would put the strain gauges right here, right where the material is thinnest, so you have the most deformation in that material. And they would all work together. So as some were in compression, it would go one direction for the voltage, and then when some were in tension, they'd go the opposite. And so how the Wheatstone bridge works is it would go here like a teeter-totter. So as your strain is increasing, you're essentially going like this for compression and tension, if that makes sense. And so here's a video of an axolotl walking. They're not very elegant, they're pretty derpy. So they just simply walked across. And we found that they were actually 97% buoyant, be supported. And so they weighed about 130 grams. So you can imagine that our sensor has to be extremely sensitive. I'll go back actually a slide because I missed something. Let's go up again. These were 3D printed by the Form Lab, and the material I used was Tough 2000. This one gave me the most durability for when an off-axis torque came. It wouldn't break the sensor. So that was the previous video. So we'll watch again. It will play. So we kind of see a similar locomotion pattern as terrestrial locomotion, right? So we have an offset of the hind and the left hind foot and the right hind foot. The left hind foot and the right front foot, they're usually working together. This is kind of seen in terrestrial locomotion as well. And sometimes when you don't want them to walk the correct way, they will just do whatever matters to them. And so they'll have a few, like I would say they're called trips. when they're doing the swing through phase, they end up hitting the substrate. And so sometimes you would have forces in the braking direction that would, just because they're moving their limb forward. They're not elegant species. This isn't an ideal model species. I'd rather work with something that's gonna have more controlled locomotion, but this is what I got. I then was thinking, okay, we have a lot of body force coming onto the force plate. How can we mitigate that? How can we mitigate the tripping along when they're walking? So I made a smaller sensor, and this one is only sensitive in this grayed out area. And the force plate is actually sitting below, and I built a grid on top of a grid. A grid on top of a grid, and that was the only sensitive spot, and then I put something grounded over top. So then it was just that little square part that was actually sensing anything. So then I was getting ground reaction forces of a single foot fall. So side view. Let's play it one more time. And you really see that back foot generating that propulsion, right? So we see a braking and then only more of a strictly propulsive force. So this is the force data that was from that past video. And we see that front foot having, that's the vertical force in blue, the yellow is lateral, and then in red is the propulsive force. So we see a braking force in red. So as it's coming up to lands and then pushes forward. But what I thought was really interesting is that lateral force, right? We don't see a lot of lateral force in terrestrial locomotion. And I think that's strictly due to buoyancy. It's wiser to go like this, kind of like rock climb is the best way that I can emulate it. And this is kind of some slides about like a few frames in between. So you can really see how these limbs are moving when they're walking. There we go. And then for our back foot, our hind foot, we have some braking, and then we have that much larger propulsive force. So we have some braking here, and then we have a much larger propulsive force compared to that first foot. And we also see greater vertical, and I think that was due from this trial that its body hit. And that's kind of why we see that like wobble at the top here. And then we have a greater lateral force. And what we found, I also did this with shrimp, sorry, never said anything about the shrimp, but spotted prawns out in the San Juan Islands at Friday Harbor Labs. These shrimp were great. I absolutely love shrimp, and I wish I could have them be my model species for the rest of my life, but it's not gonna work that way. So what they would do for me for walking, the axolotls were much tougher to make them walk, but with the shrimp, they actually would just like, la, 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 and they'd strut their stuff. They just would turn around for me and keep going. So my trials, I would just be like, okay, go, step, and I would never have to interact with the animal. But energetically speaking, if we are looking at a pendulum, right, this gold line is a perfect and energetically efficient pendulum, okay? So we found that they're not using the slip model as a mode of locomotion, right? So they are essentially doing something completely different from what all the terrestrial studies have said. And what a lot of people have thought underwater walking was using that slip model. So a lot of our robotic research with underwater walking has been using that as a model, using slip, but that's not the accurate representation. I think the reason why we're not seeing slip is because of those lateral forces. So they're trying to stay more down closer to the substrate so that way they can continue to walk. If they used more of the inverted pendulum, having their feet underneath them, that's when we see that slip. And so the shrimp, barely using any calories, very clustered here. And then this one, we're seeing absolutely no reason to think that slip model works. And some of my current research right now is working on an underwater walker because of its energetic efficiency. So again, when I was talking about station keeping, it's very energetically pulling from that system that's trying to just sit there and just hang out and like listen or look, right? So if an animal or a system can go to the bottom and just slowly move around and maneuver, turn around, it's more energetically efficient for that system. It won't pull as much power. And so we were starting to model this system after other biologically relevant systems. This is a walking cavefish, and this is some CT scans of a walking cavefish. And this system, we noticed that it's a fish and it has a pelvic fin, or a pelvis. And so we're thinking that that movement that the pelvis allows us to have is creating those propulsive forces and helping with that reorientation of fins. So I did some research on how a robot would walk, how this robot even walks terrestrially. My current research now is moving that to the water and reorienting where those servo motors are. Because if you're actuating everything at the top here, you're not getting as that turn that I was talking about before. And so they might not be able, this robot might have more slip once it goes underwater. So we want to have that rotation to be able to generate those forces, those lateral forces to go forward. So some of the larger impacts is that evolution biologists can emphasize the effects of buoyant support during a water to the land transition and compare like fin to limb transition. So this was my Ph.D. proposal. I was looking to do a study against salamanders and epileptic sharks because of the geometry of their limbs. And so we see here that we have an elbow, but we don't see an elbow here. So I wanted to looking at the substrate reaction forces on how the elbow was affecting their locomotion. And here is Tiktaalik, the famous fossil I was talking about earlier. And then over time, we see this guy get bigger and bigger, and it all essentially just reorients all of the musculature system down here. And that's the amphibious clade. And some more larger impacts, walking dynamics, biomechanists need to heavily consider some of the buoyant support. I know, Maggie, you've been having issues with buoyancy. It's just a systems problem, right? So we have to figure out how we can study like the buoyant effect on locomotion, whether it's swimming, whether it's walking underwater. So the shrimp were 93% buoyantly supported, and the axolotls were 97. So why is there a difference? Like, why is there not like a perfect one-all-be-all buoyancy? Neurobiologists trying to understand locomotive control. So without underwater walking, we would never become what we are today. All those neural networks that we have to control our limbs, they are essentially impregnated from this water to land transition because we had to start being able to move our limbs in certain ways. So that neural control is super important to understanding how this locomotion is occurring. And then evolutionary biologists, they're really interested in understanding how the fossil record was moving. So they're interested in how we can reconstruct it via using fossil records. And larger impacts, obviously for me, I'm very much into robots nowadays. So we need to consider a lot of different things for when we're designing these robots. Obviously scaling is a huge issue. Our buoyancy is going to be an issue. And then having the limb move forward, we're acting against fluid, right? So we're generating drag force by coming forward. So we're gonna have to really consider how our limb is moving forward. Just like swimming, we must have to keep our limb close when it's coming forward. And we see that in how axolotls move. So yeah, these are a few examples of some of the robots that are currently walking underwater. For me, I'm very much into space. It's me. Sorry. But for me, if you are trying to explore other planets, right, there's different gravity acting on the body. So this is the best case scenario we can study an animal or a robot moving if we want to understand how to move on different planets. So this is one of my favorite things to talk about because I just love space. And so when we can start thinking about how the biomechanics could potentially change if we have less gravity, I think that's really interesting. And then any questions from anybody? Yeah, Hannah.
Did you consider different substrates that the axolotl was actually walking on?
Yep.
Because I'm guessing bedrock's gonna be a lot different than if he had like a sandy or something.
Yep. Yep, and that's some of the research I'm getting into now is a lot of granular physics. And the lattice structure that I had as the actual force sensor, what I found when I had just a flat plate like most terrestrial force plates, I had that originally, but the fluid interaction with the force plate actually created too much noise. So I couldn't actually see the substrate reaction forces. So it was interacting with that. So that's when I moved to the lattice structure. And I was thinking about it, just how your question is phrased, that when it's walking on rocks, it's very similar because it can generate those propulsive forces and put its limb inside of the lattice structure. So I think it's a good representation of walking on rocks. Do I think it's a good representation of walking on sand? Heck no. That's where I'm going to now. I'm trying to frame the force plate and put it in sand and have the lattice, still have the lattice structure, because then you're gonna need to be able to pick up the fore-aft and the medial lateral forces. But I have to look into the porosity and how the granular jamming is gonna affect everything. So yes, that is the question I'm asking right now. So thanks.
And to follow on, do you know about how any of these like crawler bots interact with sediments or sands and everything? Like, are they pretty inefficient?
Yes. They're very inefficient. If you ever have watched a video of something underwater walking, like a robot, they're barely moving. But I think it's because they're using the slip model, because they're essentially having all their limbs structured underneath them and they're trying to walk and they just go like this. And it's very inefficient. But I think if they put this more of like a sprawling angle is what we would call it as a biologist, keep it a sprawling and have their weight be distributed out wide, I think that will become more efficient. But again, when an engineer works on it without a biologist, we're like, no, don't do it that way. That's not how it works. So yeah, of course. Yep.
So you were studying axolotls and shrimp.
Yep.
Which I guess move relatively fast.
Yep.
Do you think that at slower speeds, the inverted pendulum model might be more effective underwater?
Great question.
I know that there's at least some evidence that sea stars who move extremely slowly do follow that model.
Yep, and you see it when they're walking, you follow their body orientation. It's like really generating that slip model. I don't necessarily, if they're moving slower, shrimp weren't moving too fast. They were probably half the speed of the axolotl, and they still didn't show anything. Maybe a little bit. Here, I'll go back a little bit if it'll let me. Oh, okay, so here we see, okay, we're a box, right? So we're kind of in line with the slip model, but it's so insignificant that it's not the perfect model. You know what I mean? So maybe, but the energetic consumption is so minimal when you're moving that slow that it's like, okay, but at what cost? So great question. Thank you. Never had that one.
As a follow-up to that,
Yeah.
I'm curious if there is at all a weight to speed ratio.
Yep.
And how that all works with the slip model.
Yep, I agree. And that's where I'm going with my robotic system is essentially we're trying to emulate crocodiles moving. And so we're gonna design a robot and be able to change how much weight, so changing the buoyancy and how much force is actually going down to the substrate and looking at that and seeing if we can apply the slip model. If different weights, if more weight helps and then it can generate the slip model, perfect. And then again, with her question, is that speed, does it matter for speed? Can we just speed up the robot and see if the slip model is there and valid, or vice versa? Yeah, great question. Yeah.
So one of the things that strikes me looking at your astronauts, is that's really different
Yeah.
between moving in air and moving in water,
Yep.
is a lot of the propulsion for anything moving in water is pushing on the water.
Yeah.
Not ground reaction.
Yeah.
And so part of the transition's gotta be separating that out. So
Yeah.
there's the buoyancy
Mhm.
and gravity issue, but there's also the what are you pushing on?
Yeah.
And how do we know anything about, with the transition to land, when the shift in propulsive mode happens?
So I think a lot of it comes back to the point that they're gonna belly drag. And so their weight is essentially just laying there. Now we have to just generate more propulsive force to overcome that coefficient of friction, because they have a lot of surface area on their body cavity. So I think that there is something happening there, but we have no idea. No one's really even studied this transition that I put in a grant for. But that's the future work, is to actually understand that question.
Yeah, first of all, congratulations on all your hard work. That's
Thank you.
incredible.
Thank you.
I have a way less technical question.
That's okay.
I don't have any credibility in like STEM at all.
That's
STEM
okay.
at all. So I was wondering, is your main focus, like when I saw the space thing, like is it exploration or underwater exploration, or is it like more like for energy or for like I thought about how like the helicopters with biomechanics, they learn from like the different insects and everything.
Yep.
So that would really stuck out to me. So,
Yeah, so a lot of like my research and questions are, how can we make our tech more efficient
Oh,
at
cool.
moving? And so this is why I've looked at the biology side of things, and like, okay, evolution has been beta testing for millennia, millions and millions and millions of years, so can we pull from how evolution has done it, because they've been acting against physics their entire existence, right? So can we use some of how they're moving and implement it into our tech? But yeah, exploration is very interesting to me.
yeah, evolution's really tough. So
Yeah,
if we can get that, that'd be so
Yeah.
awesome.
yeah. Thank you.
I had a question about, so this looks like a really fun project. So looking at the shrimp versus the axolotl.
Yeah.
I guess with axolotls, you always kind of see them just kind of chilling in their substrate or the bottom of their tank or whatever.
Yep.
But shrimp, if you keep them in a fish tank, they aren't always on substrate. Sometimes they're on the glass wall,
Yep.
sometimes they're on the, stick, whatever's in there. Do they have a mechanism to actually claw into the ground, and does that affect, I guess, what you're looking at in your
Yeah,
model?
of course it's gonna affect it, 'cause, right, you're interacting with the substrate, you're able to put your hand or your claw on more substrate and generate that propulsive force. So it is gonna change it, and I believe shrimp have like not claws necessarily, but like little hands that kind of can go like this. The axolotls have hands like us that can actually grab more of the media. And my thoughts are that that type of evolution happened because as the granular media is coming through it, granular jamming could occur here and help them have more contact with substrate, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think, they're both different types of systems for sure. But that was kind of the card I was dealt to deal with my model species. I didn't get to pick. It was kind of, which one's gonna walk on the force plate for me? Because crabs, they did not wanna walk. They were like, I'm staying here and I'm gonna protect. So they didn't wanna walk for me. So shrimp, they were happy as clam. So yeah, they were just super happy to walk. They were strutting, and I'm not even like, it was like a runway for them. They were excited. I was like, this is interesting. Good question.
On your vertical force graph, there's a high frequency component.
Yep.
When the paw impacts the ground.
Yep.
What does that mean? What's happening with that?
So this part right here you're talking about?
Yeah.
So that's when the body hits it
Oh.
on this trial. Yeah, so what I'm thinking is happening, and you can see it right here and here, and that's in the first part of this, is that it bobbles up and down. And this is a lot of the hard part for when I was working with the data set, was that my full force plate, this is just a single football force plate, I was trying to mitigate some of that that you're seeing up there. You just saw the body just bouncing all the way. And so that's kind of what led to the belly dragging too. Because once you actually start coming up the substrate and starting being exposed to gravity, even if you're just partially submerged, you're having more gravity acting towards your body, so your body's gonna sit down.
And what's the time scale of the chart?
Wow, I actually don't have it on here. Oh, yeah, I do. It's just in black. So this is 1 second and this is 2 seconds. So about 1 hertz, 1 frequency of a second. Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question, if you can
Yeah.
hear me.
Yep, we can.
So I saw in some of the videos that you showed that the axolotl was walking at like a slight angle to the square plate. Did you account for that? Like when you're saying this is a lateral force, vertical force, or graph force, depending on.
Yep, so this actually does account for it. So we essentially took the directionality and then did a transformation to account for the angle that it was walking. So we did correct for it.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Any others online? Well, perfect. Thank you guys for having me and listening.